I'm so glad you won't miss this fascinating story of the telegraph and its immense effect on our lives. So let's give a great stug welcome to J.B. Burke. J.B.?
Hi there. Well, how do you do? Like I said, coming in from Prescott, Arizona, where we're like I said, almost getting up to winter time, it seems, because we're about to get some snow, apparently. We've had so far a dusting. That's it for the year. So anyway, the reason that I got into this thing about the telegraph was that I read a book. I read a lot of different books on different subjects, and it reminded me that prior to the middle of the 19th century, communication speed hadn't changed at all around the world. I mean, communication was at the speed of a horse or a ship or a runner. Um, since the 18th century, we had the telegraph. And since we had the telegraph, there's been much less of a change than before than the telegraph made. So I'm going to go through and try to give you a good idea of what's all that about. Okay, how the electrical telegraph changed the world. That's what they referred to it as, the electrical, and that's the important part right there. Um, all right, just starting off with a little scenario here. February 1825, and you're away from home, working in Washington, D.C. Your wife is back home in New Haven, Connecticut, about 300 miles away, not very far. In New Haven, your wife, Lucretia, becomes ill and suddenly passes away. A letter is promptly sent via the normal letter speed that would be in that day. And by the time you receive it, your spouse, Lucretia, has already passed away from the disease that she had. The man working in Washington, D.C. was Samuel Morse. In 1844, he sent his first telegraph message. So he had a serious reason to want to have communication be faster. He found that his wife had died before he even knew about it and could not get back for her funeral. So he had a reason for that. A bit about the evolution of communication, which is all pretty familiar to us, I think. We start off with images, drawings, and shapes and so forth. Cave art, we see from time to time new cave art discovered. Language was developed, spoken language, oral traditions passed down, stories from generation to generation, then written representation. The Rosetta Stone showing us some conversions of languages and so forth. Hieroglyphics, like the Egyptians and Chinese. Alphabets were developed, and that required media for recording. So all this went on through thousands of years, down to where the paper and papyrus were starting to be available to make books. Communication didn't get any faster at that point, but it was developing. This was one I ran across a while back, how the alphabet developed going back to 1750 BCE and down to the current modern alphabet. Now, this whole thing, I will have made into a PDF file and I'll send it out. It'll have all the links in it. So everywhere on these pages, I've got tons of links in here. So you'll be able to just click on them on the PDF files if you want to go and see more information. So I'll get that out probably tomorrow. So how messages were transmitted, postal service, messengers on horseback. I mean, there was post offices long before there was telegraph. You had letters being mailed and going by ship and carrier pigeon. Drums came along at some point in some societies, drum telegraphy. Line of sight communication was possible. Smoke signals, beacon fires, semaphore, and optical telegraph. We'll get into those in a few minutes. Cartoons, I found a couple along the way. This one here, it says, here's our faster, more efficient content delivery system. Got a drummer. All these guys are doing their cave artist said this is the first prelude to the first news media layoffs. There you go. So the speed of communication from prehistory through ancient history, Middle Ages, modern history didn't change. Speed of horse, ship, couriers, letters, smoke signals in some societies, drum beats, and so forth. In the 1790s, semaphore systems, optical telegraph. There were two kinds of telegraph. We'll get into that. More on that later. And 1844 to now, the electrical telegraph, and of course everything up until the modern day. Little bit about the transportation speed in the old days. Horses can travel 30 to 50 miles a day if they're in good condition. Top endurance horse, maybe 100 miles a day. Certain factors, of course, affect that: weather conditions, the fitness, health, and so forth. And most horses can trot 20 to 40 miles a day at a speed of 8 miles an hour without a problem. What human activities were impacted by these slow communications? I mean, you don't know that it's a problem if it's not impacting you personally, if you don't know about it. I mean, who knows what future civilization might be like if space travel becomes available to everybody. We don't say right now, gee, I miss that, because we don't have it. But family life, politics, and elections, food production, the management of that, international relations, all of these things, transportation, crime fighting, everything was affected by the slow speed of communication. Literally everything in life was slow, but who knew that it was slow, because that was the way it always was. Seems like an odd question, but how to design a telegraph? Well, it turns out there's two different ways: optical and electrical. Both were designed and built. You couldn't build an electrical telegraph unless you understood electricity. So in the late 18th, early 19th century, electricity wasn't understood. People didn't know how it worked. They knew it existed, but they didn't know anything about it, how to use it. So there were optical telegraphs built. Optical telegraphs consisted of strings of hilltops with towers like this, with a device on top of the tower to transmit the message. And it was an interesting thing. It required a lot of people and a lot of towers. We'll see in a minute. Claude Chappe, a gentleman in the 18th century France, he tried to develop an electrical telegraph system, but he couldn't, because there was just not enough known about electricity. He had a few false starts, and then he decided to go after this business of using a semaphore, flipping panels with a telescope to look at a distant hill and read the message and write it down, so you could send a message like 8 or 10 miles as long as you could see that distance. He wanted to call it, so he set up this system, sent a message 10 miles. If you succeed, you will bask in glory. Took about 4 minutes. He wanted to call it tachygraph, which was Greek for fast writer, but somebody else suggested telegraph, which that's where it came from, far writer. So there were two main types of optical telegraph: the semaphore, which used pivoted arms and conveyed memory according to the direction of how these pivots were seen from a distance. The shutter, oops, hold on, I'm getting out of control here. The shutter telegraph, which blocks panels, with panels which block light coming through, so they could be either set to open or closed. So we'll see both of those kinds of telegraphs created. This was the alphabet that he came up with for the semaphore telegraph, Claude Chappe. So by putting the arms of this thing in different positions, it could be read as different letters of the alphabet and different numbers and so forth. Looked like this. You had 98 different combinations they could send with 92 numbered pages in the book. Looked like this, though. Inside the tower, two people, one with a telescope looking at a distant tower to get the message from the last person, and this guy down here with this crank, and he's setting it up so it matches what's on the tower up here to send a particular letter or whatever, and to pass it on to the next station. So the arms are controlled by pulleys. Now, it seems kind of a silly system, seems like something that'd be kind of hard to deal with, but it was popular in France. In the French government, after the French Revolution, they needed a way to keep track of their rather large country. And so they decided to allocate money for a three-station line of approximately 20 miles overall. Required line of sights between stations, was demonstrated in 1793. Two operators at each station, one to operate the arms and the other to observe the next station. And the experiment was a success. The French system expanded greatly after the French Revolution. A 15-station line from Paris to Lille, 130 miles, was proposed. It went on eventually to spread out all over France. When Napoleon took over France in 1799, he wanted it expanded all over the place, including a station toward England, because he figured since he was conquering everything in Europe, he wanted to conquer England too. So he's going to put a station in close to England and then in England eventually. This is an actual diagram of what the system looked like in 1811. These all represent telegraph stations. These optical telegraphs were 534 stations over 3,000 miles, two people in every station, one of the telegraph, one operating the arms. And so it was a huge system, and it was, I mean, unwieldy. If you look at it, I mean, look at all the people they need to have to run this thing, but it was faster than horses, faster than any other way that was available at that moment. So this was the first telegraph system. In England, a gentleman named George Murray, he designed this shutter system. Similar thing, you had to have somebody looking with a telescope and somebody operating the shutters from down inside the tower. By mid-1830s, there were many lines across Europe and 1,000 optical telegraph towers. And some of those remained in operation for years after that, up to the late 19th century. This was the route of the of part of the line in England of using their shutter telegraph, and it was later replaced by a semaphore system. It remained in operation in France until 1852, and the last one went out of service in 1880. So I think one of the things we never really learned much about in school was there was this amazing optical telegraph system all over Europe in the middle of the 19th century, before the electrical telegraph was developed and expanded. That wasn't really taught in school. But this was very limited. Only governments could afford to use it because of the fact that it took so many people and was limited, didn't work in the dark or fog or mist. So at night, you couldn't send messages. If it was a foggy day, if it was a rainy day, if it was misty, all kinds of things can stop the messages from going through. But still, they built those systems. Here are some links to some additional information about that if you're interested when you get the PDF. But what was needed to create an electrical telegraph needed the technology to send an electrical signal over a long distance and a way to read or interpret it at the other end. So all of these things were not known at the time when Mr. Morse realized that he needed faster communication. First suggestion of an electrical telegraph was actually in 1753. And between then and 1837, when things really started to move, there were 60 or more experimental electrical telegraphs were tried. Development of the science of electricity was needed, however. Remember, 200 years ago, there were no electric lights, no batteries, no motors, no electrified homes, no electric appliances. Electricity simply wasn't understood how to use it. And that started to change. So on April 21st, 1820, early 19th century, Hans Christian Ørsted saw that electric current flowing through a wire created electromagnetism, and he developed what was called Ørsted's law. Electrical signal faded over distance. In 1832, Morse caught the telegraph bug on a transatlantic voyage. He knew there was a need for faster communication, and he overheard some people talking about the possibility of developing an electrical telegraph, and his brain said, we need to do this. Let's get started. But he didn't realize that there was a big electrical problem, so he started working on a signaling device. He was assuming was going to be a way to send messages down a wire. He was assuming that. He started working on the signal device and the code. He thought sending numbers to correspond to a code book might be good. In the meantime, more electrical inventions were taking place. Alexander Volta, where the word volt comes from, invented the electric battery in 1800. That was necessary for every telegraph machine. The French physicist André Marie Ampère worked to create a theory that explained the relationship between an electrical current and magnetism. So all of these things were happening at this point, and electricity was coming along, but still it took a long time after that for everything to be understood. First electric motor was developed by an Englishman, Michael Faraday, in 1821. They had the means now to send electrical pulses down a wire and see the effect at the other end. The trick was how to create a working machine capable of sending and receiving these impulses, and how to make the signal go without fading over the distance, because it had to go over long distances. And that was not understood at this point. The first commercial telegraph machine was invented by two Englishmen working together, William Fothergill Cooke and Charles Wheatstone. Their first version of the telegraph was in 1837, had 20 letters on a diamond-shaped board with 5 needles and 6 wires. Now, at that point, because it was only 20 letters on it, there were 6 letters missing and no punctuation. So those letters had to be kind of interpolated. A message received by the machine was indicated by slight movement of 2 needles to the left and right. And that brought in the necessity of, oops, hold on, what happened here? That brought in the necessity of having the galvanometer, which had been invented. This was a device where the plus and minus of an electrical signal would move a pointer from one side of the scale to the other, depending on how the mode of the signal was. So you had this signaling device. So he built something that looked like this. This is an actual picture of his machine. You got a triangle here, a triangle shape with 20 letters, and these are the letters on the board. You notice it's got 5 needles in the middle here. If you sent a signal that said turn this needle to the right, and this needle to the left, that would point to a G where they combined. So now we had a way of reading a signal at the other end of the line from the electrical signal sent along. So some things are coming together here. This is receiving a G. There were multiple versions of this that they worked on, including along the way. Should I let somebody in I'll do that right now. Including along the way, there was a number of different things they tried, but along the way, they ran into some of these darn things about not understanding electricity. At one point, they had run wires underground in a lead pipe, seemed reasonable at the time, and they soon began to fail because the pipe was not adequately insulating the wires, and the wires were not working, and pretty soon it got down, they were using a 1-needle, 2-wire system that required expert operators to work that. So again, even while they were being successful in some ways, they didn't understand how to put it together. So had some commercial success. They worked with the railroads a lot. But here's a case in 1845 where their telegraph allowed the capture of a murder suspect. A gentleman named John Tawell was apprehended following the use of a needle telegraph between 2 stations in London. A murder has just been committed at Salt Hill, and the suspected murderer was seen to take a first-class ticket to London by the train which left at 7:42 p.m. He's in the garb of a Quaker. They couldn't send a Q, with a great coat on, which reaches nearly down to his feet. So this message was sent. A good way to get a crime and commit a crime in those days would be to commit the crime, jump on a train, and get somewhere before they could get a message on the next train. So you could get on the train, or you could get on a ship and go across the ocean with no way to transmit the message about what you'd done. So in this case, they actually solved a crime with that somewhat limited telegraph. Here's some resources. I'm going to look into how their work went. Cooke and Wheatstone, they did a lot of stuff on the telegraph. In the meantime, a gentleman named Joseph Henry, an engineer, had solved the distance problem between 1829 and 1830 by using an electromagnet and many small batteries in a row. The signal could be sent farther. Morse and Cooke did not know that at the time. So you had people working from all directions on this, people working on the electrical, people working on the idea of trying to make telegraphs and so forth, but they didn't know about each other because in those days communication was so poor. Meanwhile, Morse spent his time developing a complicated telegraph device. Morse teamed up with Professor Leonard Gale and Albert Vail, and they simplified down to a tapping key and a pen that inscribed dots and dashes with a full alphabet of codes tuned to letter frequency. Now, letter frequency, what that meant was that the most common letters of the alphabet were given the quicker codes. So an E was a single dot in Morse code, and I was 2 dots. On the other hand, Q, which is much less common, dash, dash, dot, dash. So it had four codes, four signals rather than one, and a Y also. So there was some good thought put into this, how to make it fast, and they were developing things in the meantime, getting closer to being able to send a message along the line. Morse foresaw worldwide communication, but the electrical telegraph was hard for most people to envision. The need to demonstrate there was a need to demonstrate a large working signal system. It had been proposed to Congress to build a chap-style signal system from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. Somebody had proposed to the U.S. Congress to create a semaphore system between D.C. and New Orleans before the electrical system came along. Morse demoed his electrical telegraph but it was between 2 stations close together, and they didn't understand that this vast bale of wire that he had represented actually long distance. He had like a mile of wire, and he said, "Here's a signal in, one out." They said, "Oh, they're just right next to each other. That's no big deal." The people in the Congress were not particularly astute to electrical, obviously. And Morse went off to Europe between 1838 and 39 to popularize his design. In 1840, he got a patent for the telegraph in the U.S. So here's the patent. There's the link to the information about it. The patent that led to the creation of Morse code. Now, Morse did not, he's considered the inventor of the telegraph, but he wasn't. He just invented the tapping device and the code. All this other electrical work had to go on before that would work. So in March of 43, Morse did another demo, and now he got $30,000 from Congress to build a test system. Somebody in Congress thought it wasn't real. They passed it by 89 to 83. One congressman from Tennessee thought they might as well fund research into mesmerism. So Morse set out to build a line from D.C. to Baltimore along the B&O line, railroad line. Congress appointed John W. Clerk to be an observer of crazy Morse because they thought they just wasted $30,000 on this wacko guy that was trying to make this electrical thing work. They thought he was impractical, crazy, foolish, whatever. Observer Kirk, however, turned out to be a key cog in the wheel here because he came up with a scheme to verify Morse's system. The Whig convention, one of the U.S. Political parties at that time, were scheduled shortly for a convention in Baltimore. The D.C. telegraph line from Baltimore to D.C. was not finished yet. They were still working on it, but they were within 15 miles of Baltimore. So on May 1st of 1844, Morse got the list of the nominees from the convention, probably rode by horseback to the 15 miles to the to the end of his telegraph line and sent it to DC. And the names were announced in District of Columbia 64 minutes before they arrived on the train. So this officially verified that the system actually worked. So he beat the train by an hour. Keep in mind that horses could not go that fast. So the line was completed from DC to Baltimore on May 24th of 1844, and Morse transmitted his famous "What hath God wrought" message. But the electrical telegraph is still not taken seriously. In England, Cooke was facing the same thing. People were not believing that it was really working. They were not understanding it. There were still all kinds of weird ideas going on. Morse went back to Congress to request more funding and was promptly turned down. But that was good for Morse, I think, in the long run, because he went to private investors. In the meantime, on April 1st, the Postmaster General imposed a tariff on messages. I think he could see that the number of messages going via post office was going to go down significantly after the telegraph took over. So there was some companies formed, and a company in the U.S., Magnetic Telegraph Company. A line opened from New York to Philadelphia in January 46, and in England they started a telegraph company. The first commercial telegraph line in the U.S. was opened in 44. In 45, Morse oversaw the building of the first telegraph line linking the East Coast with the Midwest, and commercial use of the telegraph started to blossom very quickly. In 1852, Scientific American reported no invention of modern time has extended its influence so rapidly as that of the electric telegraph. 40 miles of it existed in 1846, the experiment. 2 years later, 2,000 miles, two years after that, 12,000 miles, and 11 lines extending out of New York. Now by 1852, you got 23,000 miles in operation and 10,000 miles under construction. So all of a sudden, it was the utility of the electrical telegraph was recognized, and it immediately took off. This was a map published at that time, telegraph stations in the United States, and then a big list of the cost of the sending telegraphs and the tariffs on those telegraphs. So that was going on quickly. Now, the next thing was to look at the idea of a transcontinental telegraph line. The West Coast was far, far away from the East Coast at this point. The railroad hadn't gone across country yet. The Western Union decided to put up a line to California. They merged some companies together, and there's 3 gentlemen here that had been working on doing this. The second significant step was the Telegraph Act by Congress in 1860 to authorize the government to open bids for construction. Eventually, just Hiram Sibley went at it, but then when they saw it starting to get serious and successful, his other men came back in and rejoined them. In the meantime, a while ago, I was listening to the radio in my car. I've got this XM radio. It's one of the stations is old-fashioned programs from back in the 40s and 50s, radio dramas and so forth. There was a dramatization with Raymond Massey called "Wire to the West," a dramatization of the construction of the telegraph from Chicago to the West Coast. So you can find that online, and you can listen to that if you want. It's about a half hour, I think. At completion in October of 61, they had planted 27,500 poles with 2,000 miles of single-strand iron wire over a terrain that had some serious problems. Inclement weather, snow, lightning bolts, strong winds. The bisons would rub on the poles and then sometimes knocking them down and knocking the system out. The system had to be rerouted through Chicago instead of Missouri because the Confederacy was attempting to cut the wires because they didn't want the Union to have the ability to communicate. And Native Americans thought it was a bad idea because they were hostile to the U.S. Army. So they started to do the same thing. So we had some serious communication problems in those days, even after the whole line was put through to California. But here's the map. from Chicago all the way through out to Sacramento, and where the telegraph came to California. There's the map there. Now, we've all heard of the Pony Express. The telegraph quickly shut down the Pony Express. Pony Express took about 10 days to go 1,800 miles. Faster than faster than by normal ways, but it was still pretty slow. There were 186 Pony Express stations. The key thing here is that it was put together in 1860, and it went bankrupt in 18 months. So we see all these old movies about the Pony Express and so forth. There was a very brief period in time, a year and a half. Kind of an exciting thing, but it didn't last. They could only carry a certain amount. The riders couldn't weigh more than 125 pounds. In emergencies, they might have to ride back to back. So it was really a tough thing. There were similar systems around the world as well in other places, but did not last here. Here's a map which shows a lot of detail of the telegraphy system, and this one is one that you can go to and click on various places and get some more history of the telegraph. In England, most telegraph use was by the railroads. Cooke's telegraph was expanding in other countries, got off to a slow start in France. I mentioned that their optical telegraph system was still in place, so they didn't embrace the electrical telegraph quite as quickly. Messages were called telegrams. Telegraph was built out as an unwieldy hub and spoke system because telegraphs going from one system to another might have to go through another city, in which case the message might have to be retranscribed and sent on. Some of the big cities had put up hubs where they had these tubes, pneumatic tubes, to send bundles of messages from one station to another to be re-entered. Thomas Edison and Andrew Carnegie both started as messenger boys, delivering messages for Western Union. Abbreviations became common, kind of like things like LOL and so forth are today. That started going on pretty quickly. Strange notions were still around. Some thought physical messages, slips went through the wires. A woman in Prussia took sauerkraut to a telegraph office to send to her son in the war. She said, if a telegraph could be used to send men to war, why can't it be used to send sauerkraut? Not quite understanding the thing. Problem with terminology. Current, new meaning flows along a wire. Current, the old meaning, the universal understanding was a river carrying along a vessel. Here's a link to a book that was published back in 1848, Weird Things That People Thought About the Telegraph. Then the next goal became a transatlantic cable. Could they communicate underwater? Could they put that line that long? So an engineer, Frederick Grisborne, had an idea. He had an idea of running well, they were skeptical about the transatlantic cable, but he said, well, let's take and run a cable from New York up to Newfoundland, and then go by ship from Newfoundland to Ireland, because that's a shorter run than across from New York to Ireland to Europe. They were putting together kind of a kludge here. Problem was extending across such cold distances. They couldn't run it across Newfoundland. It was too cold. There was too much bad weather. They finally got it there, but it never did take off that way, because by then they thought, well, let's put a cable across. They were starting to get a little more confident about this. The first cable went to sea in July of 1857. It weighed a ton per mile, required 2 ships to carry it. The first 350 miles were lost at sea. It restarted in June. Cable broke twice. A cable broke a third time from a whale encounter, and the ships returned to Ireland. They were coming from Ireland, coming this way toward Newfoundland. They finally succeeded in 1858. Tremendous celebrations took place. Now, these were celebrations that should not have taken place because they put egg on the face of a bunch of people. The cable was not good cable. It was not properly designed and properly engineered. Took tremendous amount of time to send messages, and it finally just failed completely. In the meantime, while they're trying to do that, the telegraph was very instrumental in the success of the Union in the Civil War. because the Union was able to run 15,000 miles of cable and have real-time battlefield control that was not possible for the South, because most of the telegraph operators returned home to the North when the war began. Most of them were from the North, so the South was hamstrung by that. So the Union had a lot of good work that way. This is a little bit about the telegraph during that time. They handled 6.5 million messages, 15,000 miles. There were 8,000 miles in use at one time. 1,200 operators and linemen. There were 175 were wounded or captured, and 25 died in service. So there were a lot of people involved in the telegraph in the Civil War. Now, in the meantime, back to this transatlantic cable, they got that cable laid, and it was a fiasco. A gentleman named Dr. Edward Orange Wildman Whitehouse, he had engineered the cable. He had no engineering experience and no practical or theoretical experience, so it was totally wrong. He said to use high voltages with huge electrical coils and a small conductor wire. Turns out what you wanted was low voltage with small electrical coils and a large conductor wire. So he missed everything. All were wrong choices. To top it off, the cable was poorly made, so it wasn't even made well to his specifications. They hired a real engineer who actually did the study, found the cable was too small, the voltage too high, and it resulted in destroying the insulation. And now, by this time, a better device was available for reading the messages and sending. Whitehouse, as would be the case in most every time these days, blamed everyone else but himself. Everyone was at fault. In 1864, a successful cable had been laid from India to Europe via the Red Sea. So now, overseas, there were some work that was going on that was working. It employed low voltages, used a mirror galvanometer like those Englishmen had. Now, money was raised for a new transatlantic cable. It would employ a larger core wire and would be more buoyant. It was so heavy that only one existing ship could carry it, the Great Eastern. It was the largest ship afloat. The first try at laying a cable was begun in June of 1865. Once again, it failed because of cable breakage. They tried again in July of 1866 with better equipment and landed in Newfoundland 2 weeks later. Now, this is the Great Eastern, the ship that laid the cable. It had paddle wheels on both sides. It had a propeller in the stern, and it had sails. So this thing was well powered and able to take that humongous coil of cable and run it across the ocean. Now, all of a sudden, the first day of operation earned 1,000 pounds, which is the equivalent of $196,000 today. Within a month, the original broken cable was recovered, spliced. They figured out how to splice cables. That became pretty commonplace, recovery and repair of broken cable. We've seen a lot about broken cables recently on the news because of the things going on over in Europe, in parts of Europe where some ships apparently have been purposely attempting to destroy some of the working cables. A gentleman named Cyrus W. Field, he's the one who paid for the work to get the cable across the ocean in the first place. He got a congressional vote of thanks. Cooke and Wheatstone were also honored. Field was honored in New York, and it was so successful that it all quickly became overloaded, just like the internet today when they first came out. New York Times reported telegraph lines were congested. I told you about from cities to city, they had to sometimes go from office to office to forward things. And intermediate offices had to carry bundles of messages down the line. But the Victorian internet had been birthed. In 1844, there were a few dozen miles of wire. 30 years later, over 650,000 miles of wire, 30,000 miles undersea, 20,000 cities and towns connected. Message went from London to Bombay and back in less than 4 minutes. In the 1860s, the telegraph was booming. The Victorian telegraph took place And by 1880, they were 100,000 miles undersea. This is a remarkable speed of growth when you think about it, because what it did was it changed every bit of working life. All of business, all of everything was changed. They thought at the time that the telegraph would bring world peace because everybody could communicate together. We know today that's not really the way things work. And opportunities for fraud, theft, and deception arose. I guess we could say that's common for today. Need for codes to become evident. Needed to have encryption. Non-English code words, numerical codes, code books. In 1872, the banks were concerned about fraud and theft, and developed a scheme to be able to safely transmit $100. By 1877, 2.5 million per year was being sent. Some of the links I've got in there have some very interesting stories about the fraud. Some people would try to go and learn things like who won the horse race in one town and then telegraph to another town and try to place a bet. If the other guy at the other end didn't know the race had already been won, try to send a bet. And then, so there were a number of people that did that kind of thing. Many attempts were made to use the telegraph for scams. Marriages were consummated via telegraph. For instance, Boston to London, there was a case where a young lady, her father in Boston had picked out a husband for her, someone for whom she had no intention of marrying, and so she drifted off to London, and then married via telegraph to the boy in Boston that she loved. Thomas Edison courted and proposed by telegraph. He was a telegraph operator. Newspaper reporting totally changed. New York Associated Press started, and Reuters in Germany. Stock exchange soared. All of a sudden, because information about the cost of stocks would be transmitted. Gold exchange became important. Stock and gold tickers were everywhere. Edison made many improvements to the stock and gold tickers. That's how he made a lot of his original money to get money for starting his other inventions. Morse was celebrated for much of telegraphy, although he's only invented the key and the code. But he got a lot of celebration out of that. Some of the things that happened by newspapers became much more profitable. By 1880, there was so much traffic that network overload occurred. Laws were passed to make telegraph scams illegal. Businesses of all types sped up. They must use the telegraph to compete. There's quite a lot of detail in these links that I've got in there about how business all of a sudden became totally different. If you were, for instance, a buyer of crops in New York, corn or wheat or whatever, and before the telegraph, it would take a week or two to find out what the crops were like coming in Iowa. Now, all of a sudden, with the telegraph, you could find out immediately how the crops were doing. So all of a sudden, if you didn't have capability to telegraph between your man in Iowa and your man in New York, you were out of business because you didn't know how to price things. So industry was totally turned on its head. Newspapers, telegraph industry itself became wealthy. Western Union handled 80% of the traffic in the U.S. Digests of news appeared. Think about blogs. Think about the Silicon Valley and the internet. So the telegraph industry in those days became extremely wealthy, as did the newspaper industry. So those kind of mirrored what happened later with the internet. Increased demand drove evolution of the technology, automatic telegraphy, paper tape, where they would punch up messages and send it very fast down the line and receive it and automatically decode it. So automatically sending punch paper tape 10 times faster than a human operator, great for news. Duplex, quadruplex, and so forth, meaning that instead of one message going down a wire, they could send two messages on one wire or four messages on one wire, all through electrical tricks they could do. Alexander Graham Bell now is working on something he called harmonic telegraphy. He had heard a twang sound over the wire, and it made him suspicious. He's a pretty bright guy. So he worked to improve this aspect of telegraphy. He filed a patent for improved telegraphy on February 14th in 1876. And about 3 weeks later, he got the patent. And very shortly thereafter, 1 week later, he transmitted, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." And now the telephone became a special case of telegraphy. Now you've got these thousands of miles of cable all over the country, all over the world, under the oceans and so forth, and a way to transmit messages by voice, because Alexander Graham Bell had come up with a way of doing that. You go to 100 to 200 words a minute instead of 15 to 20 by a Morse operator. No expense required for operation, maintenance, or repair. The first ad for telephone service appeared in May of 1877. Another instant success. The age of the telephone was born. So the number of telegraphs jumping up here, June of 1877 were 233. By August 1880, there were 30,000 telephones worldwide. Electrical innovations were rampant, making the sound better, all kinds of things going on. Electricity was being used for lighting electric trains, elevators. The age of electricity had been born. After 10 years, there were 250,000 telephones available worldwide. By 1900, there were 2 million. 1901, a telephone in one of every 10 homes. The teleprinter was developed, a telegraph way of sending a keyboard message over a keyboard. When I was in college, I worked for an airline at Midway Airport in Chicago, and a small airline company. We had places in Burbank and in Miami and in Chicago and several other cities. And we had a teleprinter. So here I was, 19-year-old kid in college, sending telegraph messages via the teleprinter in the late 50s, early 60s. And of course, as a result of that, the fax, the internet. The reason that I said I got interested in this is because the invention of the telegraph changed communication speed from the speed of a horse to the speed of electricity. That meant everything could be done, 4 minutes from London to Bombay and back, instead of weeks at sea. Now, the internet and the telephone, that sped things up as well, but it didn't make the same dramatic change. The whole world changed when this happened. All of a sudden, all bets were off. The internet made things more fun, easier. The telephone did. Here's a telephone exchange. Here you've got the supervisor sitting connected to all their ladies at the board, all women. Read an interesting book called the Hello Girls, about telegraph operators sent to Europe in World War II. They've been using soldiers for doing the telephone exchange work amongst the Allied troops, and turned out the women they sent over were far more effective at it. They did much better. There's a teleprinter. Now, after I got all that done, I said, well, what I'm going to do, and I did some of this at the beginning as well. I asked a couple of AI chatbots what were the impacts of the telegraph. The results were interesting and pretty much what I had come up with otherwise, but revolutionized communication, drastically reduced the time to send messages across long distances. Economic growth, it facilitated the growth of railroads by allowing for better coordination and scheduling. So all of a sudden, the railroad growth exploded. Financial markets, another one that blew up. Centralized power, and you could now think about this. The president could talk to his people in London or in Paris or anywhere over the telegraph. Where before, if you wanted to send a message to your man in Paris, maybe it was your what do you call it? Your chief diplomat over there took weeks to send a message over and get it back. All of a sudden, you can do it in hours. News dissemination, military strategy, and social connectivity. People could now start connecting, especially when the telephone part of it popped into place. Telegraph was still a little bit unwieldy, although I have to say I've got a book that my mother put together from me when I was born in 1940, put together for me. And in there are pictures of me and so forth, but there are telegraphs from some of my relatives. In 1940, they were sending telegraphs congratulating my mother on my birth. And there's some footnotes to that. Another one, again, said commerce and trade, finance, technology, human communication, and personal life. All were seriously affected by the telegraph. Another one, security and privacy. I asked, what are the problems and challenges? Security and privacy, interception, telegraph messages could be intercepted. Somebody at the office that's receiving a message would receive it, or somebody in the office where a message was going through could intercept it. So encryption very quickly became necessary. Economic disparities. Not everyone had access pretty much today, like the internet. Not everybody today has high-speed internet. In those days, only wealthier people could have access to the internet, so they couldn't communicate. So wealthier businesses would have a better chance of communicating and so forth. Dependence on technology, the reliability, mistakes in transmission could take place, maintenance, the need for constant maintenance and upgrades of the telegraph infrastructure, social impact, information overload. Think about in those days, a newspaper, the way a newspaper would work before the telegraph was, if you live in a little town, say we're somewhere in Nebraska, and your town had a little newspaper. Where they got their news, somebody maybe brought in a copy of a paper from another town 100 miles away and say, oh, there's an article, there's a story I didn't know about. They put that story in. So stories spread very slowly in those days. Now all of a sudden you've got the newspapers putting out 2 or 3 editions a day because news is coming in from far and wide all day. Cultural changes of all kinds took place at this point. Some references, how the telegraph worked, 9 ways it impacted the world when the electricity was first used in homes. By the way, from 1991 to now, and this is a little bit old already, 1.1 billion websites on the internet, 250,000 new every day, 50 billion web pages are indexed, 200 million websites are active. And then it came to the end. Did I talk too fast?
Wow.
So that's why I got interested in the telegraph, and why I think it is important to know that the invention of the internet has always been considered in this technological age to be the major big thing that's happened in the way of communication. And I think the real big thing that happened in the way of communication was the telegraph, and that led to all the rest of this. Yes, Carl, Melinda.
Okay,
Go
very
ahead.
good. I just want to make an observation. First, when I was growing up, we had a party line telephone. And it was only 2 parties. In Northeast Pennsylvania, we had 4 parties. And it was a big deal, and it was a big deal to talk.
Yep.
Now, then the teletype, we had teletype for sending messages, and then things have gone full circle. I can't get my kids to talk to me anymore. They send text messaging, which is a form of teletype. So it's gone full circle.
Yep, that's true. That's true. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing what's happened now. But yeah, I used to go visit relatives in Iowa when I was a kid, and they had party line. So you always hear little clicks on the line, and you would assume somebody was listening from somewhere. Wasn't very private.
By the way, I want to say thank you very much. It was very well done, and your speaking voice was perfect. Great job. Great job.
Thank you. Thank you. Like I said, I will get this out tomorrow, and you will have it soon. Bernard DeFazio, you got your hand raised?
I want to tell you this was very interesting. My grandfather was a telegrapher in World War II
Yeah.
or World War One.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. There
And
was
it
a lot
was
of
very
people involved.
interesting to learn the history of the telegraph key.
Yeah, and like it said in there that while Samuel Morse got a lot of the work, what do you call it, the
Credit?
credit for it, which is really important because developing that code, that Morse code, was extremely good, better than the ones in England with the flipping needles and so forth. But he did not. The electrical part of it was something that he had no real work with at all. But yeah, it was quite a thing, this whole deal. There's two more sheets behind her, just by the way, that I pulled out. And I didn't spend a lot of time on them. Somebody tried to diagram all the people that were involved in all the various things that happened. So there's 2 pages that you might want to take a look at the end of this when I send out the PDF. So let me.
I'm a ham radio operator, and in the beginning, you get a license, you had to be able to send or receive 5 words a minute, and then to be an extra class, which I elevated to, was 20 words a minute, and that's there's a threshold there where you no longer hear, if I say HELLO versus hello, and that's what happens when you're listening to Morse code. After a while, you don't hear the words anymore. You hear the sounds, and you can just sit there and listen, just like another language.
Yeah. One of the things they pointed out that I found along the way was that at one point it got to be an extremely lucrative job for people to have people who got really good at doing very fast telegraphy. People who could read, they don't have to listen, they could just sit there and just listen and write down the words as it came across, because it was now, they were just recognizing the words, the letters as they went along and pulling the words out of the air. And they were very, very valuable people for a while, not for very long, because the teleprinter came along and various other things. But yeah, that's.
I could add another story. My boss was in World War II. He was a decoder, and during World War II, he was I think it was in Hawaii. They had bunkers underground, like 50, 60 feet, safe from bombing, and they would decode messages over there. Well, the messages are all in cipher. They were 5-character numbers, letters, combinations. And they had like 30, 40, soldiers in the underground. And he said every day somebody would pick up their typewriter because they typed it, and they would throw it against the cement concrete wall, because after a while they would go crazy just copying those nonsense characters, typing them all day long. 20 people in a room all typing away these codes.
Yep. Yeah, I've read quite a lot about the codes too. The Bletchley Park, the work that was done in Bletchley Park in England to decode the codes done by the Enigma machine that the Germans were using, and then of course the Japanese, and that was even more difficult because there weren't as many Japanese speakers around to work on that, and then of course the use of the code talkers, the Native American code talkers, who were extremely successful in the Pacific, of sending coded messages that absolutely could not be broken by the Japanese. They had no idea what it was, and it stayed safe throughout the war.
This had nothing to do with encryption. It had to do, imagining everything that you're listening over the air is in bits of 5 characters, random letters, numbers, characters.
Oh yeah.
And that's all. You don't have any idea what your job is, to correctly type those characters, and they're coming at 25 words a minute, and you're doing that 10 hours a day before you get a break. At some point, your brain just goes crack.
Oh yeah. It wouldn't take much of that before you would really start to collapse over that. All right, let's see, Bernard.
I have my grandfather's telegraph key.
You're terrible.
It is mounted on a base of wood with a solid brass.
Yep.
I have one too. The biggest effort was making that piece of wood, making sure it had enough shellac on it. It was just the right size and polished, Spent more
Yeah.
time making that piece of wood holding the straight key, they called it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, like I said, the internet, I think it kicked off the modern age. The telegraph kicked off the modern age because it opened up communication and everything followed. Because, like I said, this guy, the one guy who had figured out a lot of the electrical part of it, the other people working on other parts of it didn't know about that because communication between scientists and engineers and so forth was not sufficient to get the messages out. Huey?
Yeah, I see a lot of resemblance to what you were saying, what happened with the internet and its growth and the issues with the bad guys taking advantage of the way it did it. And now I'm seeing the same thing with AI. So history does repeat itself.
Oh yeah, parallels, lots and lots of parallels there. Like I said, that
Fuck is
early
mine.
on. I beg your pardon? Yeah, lots and lots of parallels, like the immediate rise of spam and of scams and internet telegraph being intercepted and messages stolen and so forth, and that blended right over into the modern day of the internet. And like you say, AI, same thing going on. Yes,
Yep. All right,
Murray.
Murray. Yeah, let's wrap it up with Murray.
Did you cover it? Why is the radio Morse code different than the one used on the telegraph lines?
Why is the what?
The Morse code used by radio operators is slightly different than the one used by the telegraph operators on the railways.
I don't know. There could have been changes in the coding, I suppose, because the fact is that what you've got is equipment to send dots and dashes. And I suppose there's an infinite number of codes different codes you could generate with dots and dashes. So there may have been special codes that were put together for special purposes. I did not run into that.
Okay, I just wondered because I
Yeah.
used Morse code, but it was a different version than the telegraphy operators use as ham radio operators.
Hmm. Yeah.
Dick?
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the other things that was an amazing change was the cost of sending information. Think about the time, even in our own lifetime, when to make a long distance call was a big, expensive proposition.
Yeah. Wait till after 7 p.m. in the evening when the rates go down, and then get an operator and say, operator, would you please put me through to London or whatever? And yeah, stuff we see in the old movies. And now I was born in 1940, so a lot of that stuff has happened since then. So do we want to do one more?
Yep, let's
Bernard?
go ahead. Yep.
Bernard, you're back in the queue.
Yes, I know that there's two different kinds of code. One is the Morse code, and the other I don't know what it is.
I'll have to look into that. I will look into that. I may add that to my presentation for anybody. One of the things nice about this program is that some of the other ones I've done, because of they're all modern material, digital stuff and things about modern technology, they go old pretty fast. But this program doesn't age too well, doesn't age too bad because it's from stuff that was 150 years ago anyway. So it's not aging. It's already done.
I'm wondering if he's thinking there's two different kinds of phonics. In other words, you have the Air Force, you have the Army, and you also have amateur radio. In other words, A for Adam or A for Alpha, B for Bravo, B for Baker. Those were different codes that were used for, clarifying the letters because.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's like 3 or 4 of those, international, and there's military and so forth.
Yep. Yeah, there was a lot of development over the years on all of that, I'm sure. Yep. All right. Well, any other questions or anything?
Ann?
JB, thank you so much. I mean, what a fantastic. I can't believe that I grew up with a telephone number of Harvard 98. That was it. And that
Yeah.
was, I hate to tell you how long ago, but it wasn't that long ago when you think about the way things are going. Anyway, this was just fascinating. You kept us all on our toes. We appreciate your coming. Come back again, please.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay.
Good
I will
night,
sign up for
everybody.
this.
Thank you all for coming. We'll
Thank
see
you.
you next month.
Next month.